So we're going to dive into risk management that deals significantly with institutions of higher learning, universities, medical centers, and we're privileged to have with us this afternoon or this morning Jeff Driver. Jeff Driver's been a national faculty member of long standing in the CRM program for us. He is the principal and chief consultant for a group called the Soteria Group. Now, I asked him earlier, did I pronounce that properly? I asked him, what does that mean? He says, that name, Soteria, is the goddess of protection from harm. Soteria, the goddess of protection of harm. Ralph Borneman thinks he's the goddess of protection from harm. In any event, Jeff Driver's career spans some 25 years in risk management in the medical fields and hospitals. He was the chief risk officer at Sanford University, at Harvard's Beth Israel centers, and the Children's Hospital of San Diego. So his whole career has been devoted to risk management in medicine, in healthcare. He was also, and he's formed all kinds of ways to deal analytically with risk management decisions, is responsible for the development of their captives, been active in utilizing artificial intelligence to deal with risk management decisions, and has been a real leader in that area. His undergraduate and graduate education is really, I think, very interesting. He's got a Bachelor of Science degree in respiratory technology, has his MBA in healthcare administration. He also has a Juris Doctor, a law degree, and of course is a member of the California Bar. So without taking any more time from you, we want to welcome Jeff Driver. Jeff, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right. Good morning. Hey, thank you. So we have a little dilemma. One, I got a cold on the way over, of course, because I've been flying on airplanes. So we'll hope that the voice actually holds in there. The presentation's on the two sides, which means I have nothing to read, which is just fine because we're going to make this informal. We're going to go at a quick pace. I've put a lot of detail in the slides. You have access to the slides. So we're getting back to this topic of integrity, insurance, and higher education. Passion seems to be a very popular word in the room. I have a lot of passion around this issue of integrity especially, and especially as it cross-sections with insurance and risk management. I'm a compliance and risk management professional. I'm an academic now by training. Just finished Oxford University in August, and I'm now a PhD candidate at Case Western, and I'm studying reconciliation, which is a very strange topic, right? But not really. We'll save that for another time. So the name of the presentation is Conflicted. That is a very dramatic title, Conflicted. Because I was going to use a boring title like, discussing conflicts and insurance. Sort of boring and zzz. So I came out very bold, conflicted. And I'm talking about conflict in academic healthcare and medicine. So I'm going to use three examples. And this is really from my viewpoint. I know that the mega last year was in Disney. They got to talk about Mickey. I get to talk about the dark side. So I have to actually put a slide in here to go to the bright side of medicine, because this is the reality of medicine. We have wonderful doctors. We have great hospitals. We have the world's best, yes, probably most expensive medicine. But embedded in this, we have issues. And one of the issues we have is how we manage conflicts. And this is a topic that every American should be lasered into. This should be on your radar screen. If you're watching what's going on, if you're watching the news reports, you know that there is an opioid crisis. Still is. But have you seen the litigation that's going on? So every week we're getting reports. That's because of the conflict that pharma had, a number of pharmaceutical companies had, in relation to pushing opioids and how they went about doing that. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the Paxil crisis, and then we'll finish off with conflicts and how we manage medical injury. But again, don't leave here thinking, oh my gosh, everything's really bad out there. Everything's actually great out there for us. Yeah, we have issues in the United States, and we're thinking through, how we want to pay for health care in the future. But, overall, we have a great system. I'll leave this, it's in your slides, it's just about me, which I talked about. So I have a couple learning objectives. One, I want you to know how us risk management folk think about values and ethics. Two, we want to talk about wicked problems of practice. A wicked problem is something that's just really complicated and hard to fix. That's the short answer. And then the last thing that I want to expose you to is something called design thinking. Have you heard of design thinking? Anyone? So completely new to you. Came out of the Silicon Valley. It's been around for about 5 years. Major companies are using it really all over the world. And design thinking is probably the preferred approach rather than the regulatory and legal approach. We'll talk about that. So, what drives risk management professionals? Well, first of all, our insureds drive us. And our insureds are doctors primarily and also hospitals. And what is the Hippocratic Oath? You know about the Hippocratic Oath, right? That really handsome guy there on the, I guess you're right, came out with this saying, first do no harm. However, he actually didn't say it quite that way, so if you go into the literature, you'll find out that there's a deeper meaning. But modernly, every physician actually puts their right hand up and takes an oath that they first will stand by their patients and do no harm to their patient. And then on the left-hand side, Florence Nightingale came back and said pretty much the same thing in different words. So we stand behind our insureds and we believe first do no harm. That's the value and ethics that I've been talking about. Sorry, it went the wrong way. So on this slide, sorry, I have to turn around here. I don't have it in front of me. I want to make an important point here. So modernly, we talk about risk management, compliance, and emerging here in the United States and around the world, we're talking about ethics. Why? What's compliance, by the way? It's making sure that we follow rules and regulations, right? And there are a whole host of them, especially in the area of medicine and research. We have to have ethics because we know that we can't rely just on compliance with state, local, federal rules because we keep having the same problems, right? We have to go deeper. We have to go to ethics. So modernly, we're building in ethics, and it underlies sort of the foundation of the programs that we put in to make sure that we have integrity in academia, in research, and in medicine. Next slide. Sorry. What is that? That's a wicked problem. It's actually a hairball. You probably can't see it well. It'll be in your slides, but you know what a hairball is, right? A cat usually coughs up a hairball. This is a hairball that we use in compliance and risk management to represent that in very complicated problems, they're all tightly wound, and unpacking that, not that we would really want to unpack a hairball, but unpacking that is like, it's impossible. It is a wicked problem. And so managing conflicts of interest is what we call a wicked problem. Again, I'll leave that detail for you for later. So there's 3 areas that I want to talk about very quickly. There's this area of conflicts in medical practice and industry interactions. The second conflict is in clinical research, and the third is in how we manage medical injury. That's what we do as risk managers. We come in with an insurance product or a self-insurance product and with our agents, and we clean up in the aftermath of a medical injury, and there's conflicts in that process. So here's our physician, and he's basically like that lady of justice, only he has 2 competing interests. He has his interests, which I think are represented on the very right-hand side. No, left-hand side. No, your right-hand side. And that's kind of what he's interested in, furthering his career, awards, financially, making sure that he or she and their families are taken care of. They've got a lot of loans to pay off. All of that, but at the same time, he represents who? Of course, the patient. First, do no harm. Can these things be in conflict? They absolutely can. And that's exactly what happened in the opioid crisis. So here's a couple articles. This is Johnson & Johnson. This was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, just to kind of get you up to speed on Johnson & Johnson, is one of about 5 to 10 pharmaceutical companies that in the late 90s began a strategy of working with physicians using tainted research that suggested that opioids were safe, that the possibility of addiction was less than 1% according to random clinical trials. Turns out that that's not true. That evidence is not true. That these studies were manipulated actually by the pharmaceutical companies in this particular case. And so what happened here with Johnson & Johnson, we're picking on Johnson & Johnson because they're the company to go after. They're the largest of the pharmaceutical companies. They've also been in the news for other problems around talcum powder. Last week they had a recall on baby powder again, this time for asbestos. So they're the big boys to beat up. In Oklahoma, so what's happened here, $364 billion over 4 years, it's been estimated, is the price tag for cleaning up the opioid problem. Not to mention, the priceless part of lives lost, about 400,000 lives lost in the opioid crisis. And if you look at who's losing their life, it's people like you and me, okay? We're not talking about the people that are doing street drugs. We're talking about people that went to their doctors, got on this medicine. Who's taken opioids? I did. I broke my hand. They not just gave me 5 or 10, they gave me bottles with refills. This is the way we were doing it back then. And so Johnson & Johnson in Oklahoma Attorney General came out and said, you know what? Our state has lost a lot, not only lives, but financially. And we're going to sue these manufacturers, and they did. And what happened in those cases, this was only 2 or 3 months ago, it is the beginning of the end is what happened here. Because the pharmaceutical companies settled those claims with Oklahoma because, first of all, Oklahoma used a very novel legal approach. They used nuisance laws, which is a very interesting approach. Basically saying that Johnson & Johnson, Purdue Pharma, and others created a public nuisance by the way they acted in a corporate way. The case is settled. So then it goes to Ohio. It's in Ohio, sitting in a court in Ohio, multi-jurisdictional. And did you hear the news yesterday? Those cases are settling. All of this is because they're dealing with what I would call really bad facts. Here's a little video, just to give you a sense of it. I am going to play a bit of this, because, you can listen to me, or you can listen to these reports, which are much more dramatic. But I wanted to give you a sense of this conflict and why it's so important to all of us.
Johnson & Johnson will be the defendant today when an opioid-related lawsuit goes to trial. The state of Oklahoma has accused the pharmaceutical giant of falsely downplaying the risk of opioid addiction. It's the first trial of hundreds of lawsuits against opioid manufacturers. CTM consumer investigative correspondent Anna Werner has that story.
I woke up one day and was addicted to opiates and had no idea how that happened.
Jamie Stafford says her dependence on painkillers prescribed to her after a 2007 car accident put a financial and emotional strain on her family.
My family couldn't understand what was going on with me. Who was this person that I had become?
While in recovery, she met Thomas, now her husband. He had wound up addicted following a 2013 motorcycle crash.
I tried to have a full conversation with my doctor about lowering my dose, and he ignored me.
At the peak of the opioid epidemic, overdoses killed more than 500 Oklahomans a year. In 2017, the state filed a lawsuit accusing major pharmaceutical companies of executing massive and unprecedented marketing campaigns, misrepresenting the risks of addiction, making billions of dollars in profits, and leaving Oklahoma to bear the enormous costs of the resulting public health crisis.
And this isn't just a bad thing, it's a horrible thing.
Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Hunter sat down with Tony DeCoppel last year. He's expected to deliver an opening statement in today's trial.
They put profits over patients. Whatever culture existed in these companies that allowed that to occur is something they need to be held accountable for.
And that's where I'm going to stop. So clearly we have a problem with the pharmaceutical companies. But what about our physicians? Should we hold them accountable? Some of them, yes. You may have saw a report yesterday. There are some physicians, a really infinitesimal portion of physicians, that actually profited and pushed pills. Not many. Actually, most of our physicians unwittingly thought that they were using what's called best evidence. The best evidence comes from my randomized clinical trial. Unfortunately, what they didn't know is that it's alleged, anyway, I haven't actually verified this independently because it hasn't gone to trial. We don't see these documents. Those studies were doctored, using a pun there. They were doctored. So while they were relying on best evidence, and they had sales folks coming in and saying you should be using this for non-malignant causes, for ordinary pain, and that the risk of addiction is so low, this push, the pharmaceuticals made a ton of money. The physicians thought that this was not only safe, but it was an efficient way to manage pain for their patients. Obviously, something went very wrong here. So modernly, what we're talking about is how do we manage our interactions with pharmaceuticals? So as a risk manager, I want to make sure that my physicians and my administrators are managing these interactions so that they're always above board and they understand they have a conflict. First, do no harm. So, by the way, that last article came from Britain. That's in one of the newspapers, and it's a full expose on sort of the mix of capitalism and conflicts of interest. We have a capitalistic approach, which means there's a profit motive. These pharmaceuticals have an interest in developing blockbuster medicines, bringing them to market, protecting them under a patent, and then evergreening them, trying to keep that patent for a long time. They have every incentive in the world as a private company to push pills. So there's an inherent problem for pharmaceuticals. I'm not trying to beat up on them, but we need to be aware of these kinds of things. And we, as just getting your own health care, you need to be able to be aware and ask these questions of your physician. So that's more the detail that I talked to you about, and I'll leave that for you. Second conflict of interest I want to talk about, it's a study called Study 329. This was done in right around the turn of the century, 2001. Paxil. Does anyone remember Paxil? So Paxil is a drug put by GlaxoSmithKline, and it was based on a clinical trial, a random clinical trial by a lead researcher out of Pennsylvania. I'm not here to talk about him. But he actually didn't do the research, as it turns out. Guess who did the research? The pharmaceutical company did the research. He put his name on it. He said that he had independently verified the data, but guess what happened? So leading medical journal that physicians relied on started pushing out Paxil to adolescent patients for depression. And what was observed after that is that there was an increase in the amount of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and actual suicides. So in 2015, a new study was commissioned. Very rarely does this happen, but they were able to go back to the data, reassess the data, and actually had a contrary result. It actually made depression and suicide ideation worse, not better. So we had a conflict in the research, the clinical trial itself. The most interesting thing about all of this, you would think that after this new study, in which the safety of the medication has been exposed for what it is, that there would be a retraction of the original clinical research. But guess what? It still stands. It's still on the books. as valid clinical research. So these conflicts, so there's some more articles you can read about. These conflicts are very serious. I'm going to play a little bit of this just to kind of give you a sense. Behind all of this, you know, while I can stand up here and we can all talk about this from an insurance perspective and we can be very scholarly about it, behind this are real stories about real people that have been affected by this. And this will start in just a second, I believe. Yeah, is it moving? I don't know. This might not be working. Ah, now it's moving. So while I was getting ready to load, what I want to let you know is we'll never know actually how many kids lost their life because of the Paxil fraud, because it's really hard to actually identify that it was due to the medication. These kids, I call them kids or adolescents, had pre-existing issues that made them susceptible to suicidal ideation and suicide. But watch this for a bit.
Every one of us uses prescription drugs at some time in our life. We take it on trust that these pills are safe. But are they?
The suicidal thoughts only happen while I was taking the drug. They've never happened before or after.
Some of the most influential names in medicine are now asking if we're being told the truth about the pills that we take.
It has serious implications for the whole of psychiatry. It has serious implications for the whole of medicine.
For more than 2 years, Panorama has been investigating your concerns about Seroxat, one of the world's most controversial drugs.
Generic name.
I'd never thought about suicide before I took Seroxat, and when I was taking it, I was obsessed about death. It was part of my everyday life.
What you've been telling us has exposed major failings in this country's system of medicine's regulation.
And that's where I'm going to stop. So it's that last point. We're expecting that a patchwork of federal, international, and local rules will protect us from this, right? That's what we're expecting. Do you think that really works in the real world? I would say 95% of the time, yes. But then you have these really dramatic cases with a significant loss of life and a significant economic impact. So, you know, this goes on and on. You can read about it on your own. 2 conflicts that we've talked about so far. The conflict of industry interactions that our physicians have with medical device makers and pharmaceuticals, and these conflicts in clinical research. These are all the laws. There are many of them. This is actually just a sampling. We have laws that protect how we do clinical trials, how we protect human subjects in clinical trials. We expect physicians to disclose conflicts of interest. We expect pharmacy and device makers to disclose their conflicts of interest. We track, we trend, we sue. We do all of this, but it's really just not enough from a risk management perspective. So there is a better way. The better way is this thing that I call design thinking. Design thinking emerged about 10 years ago from a company in Silicon Valley called IDEO. It's been adopted by Stanford, and I came from Stanford. Every student is given the option to learn design thinking and integrate it into their practice, whether they're a teacher or a scientist or an engineer. Design thinking is a process to improve processes and systems. And so modernly, we're using this to address gaps between federal laws and actual practice. And it kind of looks like this. It's a 5-step process. I just want you to get some idea of it. It uses this practice called ethnology. So if who took anthropology in college? Remember Anthropology 101? It was like a staple for all of us. But researchers in anthropology, they actually go into the village and they observe practices or phenomena. The same thing about design thinking. What we do is we go in and we observe and understand in a very rich way the practices or the gaps in practice in conflicts of interest, for example. So we empathize with our physicians. It's a very ineffective process. So, you know, if you are a physician or even as an individual, do you want disclose, every time you think you might have a conflict of interest. It's not a natural thing for us to do. So we ask ourselves, how might we make that process better? We observe them in practice. We define this problem. We get really clear on what the problem is, because sometimes we think the problem is this, and it actually turns out to be something else. And then we create solutions. We ideate. We prototype that solution and test it. This is a 5-step design thinking process. And I'm going to show you how we use it. So, the first step is always making sure that you're answering the right questions. I'm going to give you an example of how we did this at Stanford, which was very leading. And it's in this area of the ethical management of medical injury. And just to give you a sampling of why we got started, I'm going to show you a TEDx talk from one of my colleagues, Lonnie Schweitzer, who lost her son in a Stanford hospital. She then became an employee.
The nurse grabbed the recliner and jerked me awake. I heard code blue and the room filled with people. In that instant, I knew he was gone. The doctor's words attempted optimism, but their faces betrayed them. The next hours were awful. My sweet boy had become a corpse hooked to machines. I sat next to him, begging him to come back to me. But really, I wanted to flee. I didn't want any of this to be happening. I wanted to wake up stiff and uncomfortable in that ugly blue chair and realize it all was just a very bad dream. But this was far worse than a nightmare. My 20-month-old son had just died in one of the country's leading hospitals. On Thursday, he was sick, and on Tuesday, he was dead. That night, when he had been admitted to the hospital, white circles with wires were stuck onto Gabriel's bare little chest to monitor his breathing and heartbeat. Every time he made the slightest little wiggle, the alarms would go off, and they're loud. Every time we would almost be asleep, the racket and worry would start all over again. We'd already spent sleepless days and nights in my local hospital where he had been misdiagnosed again and again. But now we were in a university hospital for children. Finally, here, I felt safe and very tired. And I'm sure the nurse could see how tired I was, and she wanted to take care of me too. So she did the logical thing. She turned off the alarms on the machine next to his bed. And I thanked her when she did it. I was so grateful for the prospect of silence and sleep. Later, doctors and administrators from the hospital would explain that actually, unknowingly, she had done a lot more. She hadn't just turned the racket off in the room. She'd turned off all of the alarms everywhere, in his room, at the nurse's station, and on her pager. Later, the manufacturers of the monitors would explain they didn't think anyone would go through the trouble of 7 screens to turn off all of the alarms. So they didn't include a failsafe to stop her. They were wrong. So when Gabriel's heart stopped beating, there was no sound, just quiet. Nothing woke me until several minutes had passed, and I was being jerked awake, and the room filled with people and panic. Imagine if you were that nurse, if you had done what she had done. You're doing your job, a demanding job, an important job, and you do something that causes someone to die. A beautiful child dies because you think you're doing a good thing. Then your shift is over, and you have to look his mother in the eye and tell her goodbye. And the next day, you're expected to go back to your job, carry on, go about your business, all the while hoping and trusting that nothing else terrible happens.
Okay, yes, that is terribly heavy. But this leads us to the risk management response and our insurance response. And you're part of this community of insurance agents. So what did we typically do? If you looked at the facts here, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you pay out a multi-million-dollar settlement? You would point the finger at who? The device provider. They failed to put in the proper safeguards so that a nurse could not unintentionally turn off the alarms. We could have escaped from this case. But this was a pivotal moment for us because we recognize in risk management that we actually have our own conflicts. We have two duties. We have one duty to our insured. Their credo is first, do no harm. But then on the other hand, we have this other conflict, which is we have an obligation to our insurance company, or it is a fiduciary duty. And it's to preserve the assets within that insurance company. So the one side of my risk management hat says, I'm going to point the finger at the device maker. We didn't do anything wrong here. I'm going to stand behind this nurse. We're not going to pay a penny. We're going to delay, we're going to deny, and we're going to defend. That is the number one legal strategy in the United States around medical malpractice. We said no. This madness is over, and we went to something that is now known as a communication resolution program. It allows us to take accountability for what could have been done better. It allows us to compensate the patient, and it allows them to move on, or hopefully begin to move on. This is why I'm studying reconciliation, because the term resolution, communication resolution programs, if you actually talk to the patients and their families, we never resolve. The best we can hope for is reconciliation. So the program that we put together, some complicated slides, there's that strategy, claim denied, delay, deny, defend, still used in the United States, thank you, still used in the United States and very, very prominent. You'll never be touched by medical error, hopefully, in your life. But medical error in the United States is a known phenomenon. 400,000 people die due to medical error every year in the United States. And that's just those that die. Others are injured as a result of medical errors as well. So we said, no, this is not going to be our strategy. And we came up with a new program using design thinking, the principles of design thinking. We asked ourselves the question, how might we design a better approach to managing the aftermath of medical injury? We came up with a new program called the Process for Early Assessment, Resolution, and Learning. They'll probably be changing that resolution word soon. Complicated slide, but basically through ethnography, we actually tried to understand deeply what our patients were going through and our insureds. Our insureds are the physicians and nurses. They want to move on as well. They want to be supported, but they also want to do the right thing by their patients. So we basically merged and rid ourselves of these conflicts and said, we actually have one interest in risk management and insurance, and that's to stand behind our insured. And there is a continuing harm, if you will, if you delay, deny, and defend, because that person, that family, or that patient, if they haven't died, they continue to be harmed by our risk management actions and the way we handle our insurance. So, new program, it's caught fire around the country. I'll give you a little example of what the program looks like. So you go to the Stanford website, you'll find this video. I'll just play a little bit of it.
I'm
so you get a
Leilani
sense.
Schweitzer.
There she is again.
I'm the patient liaison for Pearl and a parent who's gone through the Pearl process.
PEARL stands for the Process for Early Assessment and Resolution of Loss. There are benefits and risks for every medical procedure. And even with the best of medical care, rare complications and unanticipated outcomes sometimes happen.
Pearl helps bring understanding. After my son died, I was confused and I was sad and I was angry. My whole world had been turned upside down. Nothing made sense to me. I didn't understand what had happened to him. Pearl answered my questions.
Pearl is designed to address significant, unanticipated, or adverse medical outcomes. You may have a concern about your care, or you may even feel your care caused more medical problems and wonder if it could have been prevented. This is why we created Pearl, to help our patients and their families when these kinds of concerns or events occur. Pearl allows us to better understand what has happened in a patient's care, and if preventable, to keep it from happening in the future.
So I want to just give you a sense of this program. The program has been wildly successful. We've published on this. We've reduced at Stanford the number of lawsuits dramatically. I could only tell you that the before and after, we used to have hundreds of lawsuits. Now, on an annual basis, we have a handful of lawsuits because the predominant approach is this approach. And what do you think the financial outcome on that looks like? So yes, you may be paying indemnity dollars, but guess where you're saving dramatically? Deny and defend is extremely expensive. Lawyers make $600, $700, $750 in the medical malpractice area per hour, and we just use them willy-nilly. So there's a significant savings. We can take that savings and reallocate it to the indemnification. The program has been very successful, and it's not just at Stanford. These programs have popped up around the country, University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins. I mean, they're catching on like wildfire. So really just a better way to go to manage a conflict of interest using this thing, another picture of design thinking. Now what's different here, and I am finishing up in the next 2 minutes, look at this loop, this feedback loop. Just because you improve in a process, whether it's your physician interaction process or your clinical trial process, or here our medical injury process, you have to continuously reiterate. Because as we put in these improvements, we actually find defects. One of the defects in handling medical injuries is guess who does the resolution on compensation? It's still the risk manager. Do I not still have a conflict? I can't help myself. What am I going to go for? Say I was trying to resolve something with you, God forbid, right? I can't help the conflict that I have, my fiduciary interest. And I'm going to negotiate on behalf of my insured, I'll say you're the physician, the best deal that I can. It may not be the best deal for you, and you're completely unrepresented in these programs. We have to recognize these conflicts and improve them. So design thinking is a process that we can use, whether it's conflicts with physician interactions in the industry, clinical trial conflicts, or even risk manager conflicts in the face of medical injury. So you pretty much got the idea. I took you on this whirlwind. I did it in 20 minutes, less than I had planned for, because we want to make sure you have a break, very important. We do have a few moments if you had questions. I'm sorry to be so down and depressing about this stuff. Remember Norman Rockwell? There's a lot of good stuff going on in medicine. I wish I could bring Mickey Mouse up. I wish I was working at Disney. It just seems like a happy place, although I guess if you peel away the layers, even at Disney, they have their issues as well. That's why we're in the business we're in. We're here to make a positive change, and we do that every day. I think the previous session you were talking about that. So what I want to leave you with is that conflicts exist. They exist for you in your daily life, both as a professional and as an individual walking through society, so be knowledgeable. Recognize your conflicts, disclose your conflicts, and those of your insureds as well, your clients, they have conflicts. So I'll just leave you with one more thing. Remember Marsh McLennan, or Marsh? Do you remember what happened back in, my gosh, when was that? 80s? Contingent commissions? Do you remember that whole thing? That's an example of conflicts within the brokerage or insurance agency business, non-disclosure of financial interest. So that's where I'll leave it. If there's any questions about, we have just a couple minutes. Anybody? I have to jet out of here. I have to get on a plane in an hour and a half, which is like 50 minutes away. So you've been a great audience. Your eyes are on me. And I hope you have a great session. The cocktail party will be probably your best thing. And I see we're ready to close out the session.
We are ready. I'm waiting to say, oh, there it is. How about it for Jeff Driver, ladies and gentlemen? Give it up for Jeff. If you don't mind, Jeff, you are quite the educated man. I read your bio, like health administration, nursing, everywhere,
Yep,
right?
yep.
And then the whole design thing.
Yes.
Gad, Zookies, and you got zhuzhy glasses on. Good for you. All right, give it up for Jeff Driver.
Thank you.
Now, he was talking about something. You are set for lunch now. It is time for lunch. Lunch is on your own, but you want to be back here at 1:15. Meet back here at 1:15. And don't miss out on the reception in the Wildflower Room, which is around the corner to the left, at 5:15, okay? So, but be back here at 1:15. I'm watching all of y'all. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dr. Holt. Do you have something else to say?
No, ma'am, we're done.
You're done.
Thank
you, Jeff.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Great job.
Go
Thank
eat.
you.
Go eat.
Videos are impressive.
Yeah, amazing, right?
Oh.
Yeah.